There's a cycle that has taken down every major empire in recorded history. It wasn't simply conquest, invasion, or uprisings. The real trigger was economic failure, especially the collapse of the currency, and it has played out the same way every single time. Rome, the empire that dominated much of the known world for 500 years, fell apart once its money lost its value. Spain, which once possessed more gold and silver than any nation before or since, went through repeated bankruptcies until its empire unraveled. Britain, which led global trade for 2 centuries, watched its empire fade within 10 years after its currency crumbled. 4 separate times, a leading empire has followed this exact pattern. Too much military reach, spending it couldn't sustain, watered-down currency or excessive money creation, rising prices, fading trust, collapse. And every time, the leaders in charge insisted they were the exception, that their empire was unique, that the old rules no longer applied. They were wrong every single time. And now, in 2025, the United States is walking down the same road step by step, signal after signal. The only unknown is whether we're at the start, the midpoint, or approaching the end. This is the story of how empires destroy themselves by destroying their own currency. How Rome, Spain, and Britain did it, and why every indicator suggests it's happening again. Let's start with Rome, the empire that ruled Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for over half a millennium. At its height, Rome governed around 60 million people across 3 continents. Its army had no equal. Its public works were more advanced than anything else on earth. And its currency, the denarius, was trusted everywhere from the British Isles to Egypt. The denarius began as a silver coin introduced in 211 BC. It held roughly 4.5 grams of pure silver. For centuries, its value held because the Roman state protected its purity. The moment you received a denarius, you knew exactly what it contained: genuine silver, real value. That trust allowed Rome to finance expansion, pay its troops, and build the backbone of its empire. But maintaining an empire is costly. Generation after generation, Rome pushed its borders outward. Every new frontier meant more troops, more defenses, more roads, more bureaucracy, and eventually more expenses than Rome could cover. So they did what every empire does when outlays exceed income. They weakened the currency. Nero, who ruled from AD 54 to 68, was the first to meaningfully cut the denarius's silver content. He needed money for lavish living, grand projects, and expensive campaigns, so he ordered the mints to drop purity from 100% to 90%. That extra 10% became pure gain for the state. With the same amount of silver that once produced 10 coins, Rome could now strike 11. More coins created without more silver, that's inflation. But 90% silver was still respectable. The real damage came later. Under Emperor Caracalla around AD 211, the denarius was down to 50% silver. Half silver, half cheaper metals. By AD 265, under Emperor Gallienus, it had only 5% silver left. A coin that had once been nearly pure was now 95% base metal coated with a thin layer of silver. Imagine being a Roman soldier in AD 265 getting paid in denarii worth a twelfth of what troops received 200 years before. The government insisted nothing had changed. The coins still bore the same name and the emperor's profile, but their buying power had collapsed. Prices surged. Goods that cost 1 denarius in AD 200 cost 50 by AD 300. Farmers refused to sell crops for coins and demanded barter instead. Soldiers wouldn't serve unless paid in gold or supplies. Tax collectors couldn't gather taxes because the money had become worthless. The economy ground to a halt. And here's the key point. Foreign armies didn't cause this. Rome's borders were still held. This wasn't the result of plague or natural disaster. The Romans did this to themselves. Their government destroyed the currency to pay bills it couldn't afford, and once the currency died, the empire went with it. By AD 476, the Western Empire officially fell, not because invaders were too strong, but because Rome could no longer pay its soldiers, fund its administration, or keep its systems running. The money had been wrecked, and everything that relied on it collapsed. The sequenced military expansion, runaway spending, currency weakening, inflation, the breakdown of economic life, collapse. Rome proved the model. Every empire afterward repeated it. Now jump ahead 1200 years. Spain in the 1500s. The Spanish Empire is entering its golden age. Columbus has opened the Americas. Cortés has toppled the Aztecs. Pizarro has seized the Incan Empire. Spain now controls the richest lands on the planet. In 1545, Spanish miners uncover Cerro Rico in Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia. This wasn't just any mine, it was the largest silver deposit ever found. For the next 100 years, Potosi would produce nearly half of the world's silver millions of pounds. Fleet after fleet carried this treasure across the Atlantic, flooding Spain with unthinkable wealth. Spain minted the silver into coins. The Spanish dollar became the world's first truly global currency. It circulated from Europe to Asia, trusted for its purity and abundant supply. Spain quickly became the richest and most powerful empire on earth. At its height, Spanish territory stretched across every inhabited continent. The sun literally never set on its holdings. Then, just like Rome, Spain ruined itself. Money has a paradox. You don't become richer if the amount of money rises faster than the amount of goods. When Spain poured oceans of silver into Europe, prices climbed. What cost one coin around 1500 cost 10 coins a century later. The silver itself wasn't weaker, there was simply far more of it. That's inflation. Spain imported so much silver that it destroyed the value of silver. And worse, Spain wasn't building industries or fueling innovation. It wasn't creating value, it was extracting it. The silver arrived from the colonies and then flowed back out to France, England, and the Netherlands in exchange for goods Spain didn't produce. By the late 1500s, Spain's rulers were drowning in debt. Philip Roman II, who reigned from 1556 to 1598, inherited enormous obligations, 36 million ducats. Rather than cut spending, he borrowed even more. He waged war against the Ottomans, against Protestant rebels, against England. When the debts became unmanageable, he stopped paying. In 1557, Philip Roman II declared bankruptcy, the first modern sovereign default. But it was only the beginning. Spain defaulted again in 1560, in 1575, and in 1596, 4 times in 4 decades. Even though it controlled half the world's silver supply, Spain couldn't stay solvent. Each default crushed confidence. Lenders turned away. Interest rates shot up. And the Spanish government responded by debasing its coinage, issuing money with less silver and introducing copper coins that were supposed to equal silver ones. No one trusted them. The currency's credibility collapsed. By the 1600s, Spain was in irreversible decline. It struggled to fund its military, and its colonies drifted away. After the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia marked the start of the end. By 1700, the empire was basically gone. The nation that had once held the world's wealth had borrowed and spent itself into insignificance. The pattern again: huge inflows of wealth, excessive government spending, heavy borrowing, inflation, repeated defaults, collapsing trust, decline. Spain showed that even endless resources can't save an empire from financial mismanagement. Now we arrive at Britain, the empire that lasted longer, reached farther, and gathered more wealth than Rome and Spain combined. At its height in 1922, the British Empire governed about 458 million people, a quarter of the global population, and controlled a quarter of the world's land. The sun never set on it because somewhere at every hour, British authority held, and its currency, the pound sterling, underpinned the whole system. For over 200 years, the pound was the world's reserve currency. More than 60% of international trade was settled in pounds. The gold standard supported everything. 1 pound could be swapped for a fixed amount of gold. That foundation gave Britain immense credibility and influence. But empires run on borrowed money, and those debts eventually come due. Britain financed its expansion with bonds and long-term loans. Wars, colonies, massive public works, all funded through credit. As long as the pound stayed strong, this worked. Then World War I erupted. In 1914, Britain's national debt sat at around $650 million. By 1919, after years of total war, that figure had jumped to over $7 billion. That's more than a tenfold increase in 5 years. Britain had borrowed from its citizens, from the United States, from any source available. The war also forced Britain to leave the gold standard. When WWI began, the government suspended gold convertibility. It had to print money to pay for the war and couldn't keep gold backing at the same time. The pound became a fiat currency, supported only by government assurances. After the war, Britain tried to restore the old system. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, put Britain back on gold at the per-war rate. It was disastrous. The pound was overvalued, making British exports too expensive. Jobs disappeared. Interest rates had to remain high to defend the currency, straining the economy. By 1931, Britain was forced off gold again. The pound was devalued, and trust began to fade. But the real blow came after World War II. Britain entered WW2 already deeply indebted. After the war, the situation was catastrophic. By 1945, national debt reached 270% of GDP. The empire had exhausted itself to defeat Germany. Cities were destroyed. The economy was barely functioning, and Britain owed massive sums to the US in 1944. While WW2 still raged, the Bretton Woods Conference reshaped the global monetary system. The pound officially lost its position as the world's main reserve currency. The US dollar replaced it. Britain fought to preserve its currency's prestige, but it was finished. The debt was too large, and the economy was too weak. What followed was a slow, painful decline. In 1947, Britain attempted to restore convertibility. The attempt collapsed within 6 weeks after a rush on the pound. In 1949, the currency was devalued by nearly a third. In 1967, it was devalued again. Each blow weakened trust, wiped out savings, and signaled the end of Britain's era as a global power. Meanwhile, the empire unraveled. India gained independence in 1947. Egypt seized the Suez Canal in 1956, and Britain's attempt to respond ended in embarrassment. One colony after another broke away, not because foreign powers defeated Britain, but because the empire lacked the money to sustain control. By the 1970s, Britain was close to economic ruin. Inflation hit 25%. The country had to seek an IMF bailout. The pound, once the bedrock of global finance, had become a symbol of decline. The empire that once dominated a quarter of the planet lost nearly everything within 3 decades, not through military defeat, but through currency collapse and overwhelming debt. The pattern once again: staggering war debts, weakening currency, loss of reserve status, devaluation, inflation, imperial disintegration. Britain proved that even the mightiest empire can crumble in a single generation if its currency fails. And that brings us to the present. The United States, the current global empire, the issuer of today's reserve currency. And every warning light that signaled the downfall of Rome, Spain, and Britain is glowing bright. Start with the currency. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system anchored global finance to the dollar. It was backed by gold at $1.35 an ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar, which itself was backed by gold. Dollars were literally as good as gold. But like Rome and Britain before it, the United States began spending more than it brought in. The Vietnam War, major social programs, and expanding global military footprint all required huge outlays. By the 1960s, other nations noticed that the US was printing more dollars than it had gold to support. France under Charles de Gaulle started demanding gold in exchange for dollars. Other countries followed. Gold drained from US vaults. The US bluff was about to be exposed. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended gold convertibility. From that moment forward, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, just like the watered-down Roman denarius and the post-1931 British pound, backed only by trust and government promises. At first, nothing seemed to change. The petrodollar system of the 1970s created engineered demand for dollars because global oil contracts were priced in them. But spending kept climbing. Debt grew faster. In 1980, US national debt sat around $900 billion. By 2000, it had reached $5.6 trillion. By 2020, it was $27 trillion. Today, in 2025, it surpasses $36 trillion. That's a 40-fold surge in under half a century, and the pace is still accelerating. But debt is only part of the issue. Like Rome diluting its silver and Spain flooding the world with bullion, the United States has been creating money on a massive scale. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve has conjured trillions of dollars out of thin air. They called it quantitative easing, necessary to keep the economy stable. During COVID, over $4 trillion were created in just 2 years, more new money than in the entire previous century combined. And just like every empire before, officials insisted it wouldn't spark inflation. They claimed economic theory had evolved, that the old rules didn't apply. They were wrong. Inflation hit 9% in 2022, and actual living costs, housing, food, medical expenses rose even faster. The dollar is losing value slowly at first, then more noticeably, following the same accelerating pattern seen in every prior collapse. And like Britain in the mid-20th century, the US is losing its reserve currency position. In 2000, more than 70% of global currency reserves were held in dollars. Today it's around 58% and dropping. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and new additions are building alternatives. They're trading in their own currencies, developing new payment pipes, and reducing dependence on the dollar. China and Russia are buying gold aggressively. Central banks across the world are diversifying away from US assets. Global finance is preparing for the dollar's decline, just like it prepared for the pound's downfall. The trend is undeniable. And here's the most alarming part. America has fallen into the same trap Rome did: military overreach. The US maintains nearly 800 bases in more than 70 countries. Its defense budget exceeds $800 billion a year. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost over $8 trillion. This kind of global military footprint demands enormous spending, funded increasingly by borrowing and money creation. Rome couldn't keep its legions paid once its coins became worthless. Spain couldn't maintain its armies after defaulting repeatedly. Britain couldn't support its empire after its currency deteriorated. The US is facing the same pressures. So let's outline the pattern, because once you recognize it, it's impossible to ignore. Every empire that collapsed economically moved through the same 7 stages, not similar ones, but identical ones. Stage 1. Dominance. The empire sits at its height militarily, economically, and monetarily. Rome had the denarius. Spain had the silver dollar. Britain had the pound. The United States has the dollar. At this point, the currency is backed by something solid: gold, silver, or long-established trust. The empire appears unbeatable. Stage 2. Overreach. The empire stretches itself farther and farther. More territory, more bases, more commitments, more promises. Rome sprawled across 3 continents. Spain tried to control trade across the globe. Britain governed lands all over the world. The US maintains a presence on every continent. The costs start exceeding the benefits. Stage 3. Chronic deficits. The empire spends more than it takes in. At first, the shortfall seems manageable. They borrow. They issue bonds. They reassure lenders. But the deficits stop being temporary, they become baked into the system. Rome needed to pay its legions. Spain needed money for endless wars. Britain needed to fund 2 world wars. The US runs trillion-dollar deficits even in times of economic expansion. Stage 4. Currency debasement. Borrowing and taxes aren't enough, so the empire undermines the value of its own money. Rome reduced silver in the denarius. Spain overwhelmed the world with silver, inflating prices. Britain abandoned gold and devalued twice. America left gold in 1971 and has been creating dollars freely ever since. Stage 5. Inflation. When the supply of currency rises faster than goods, prices climb. Rome endured prices rising 50-fold. Spain saw widespread inflation across Europe. Britain had runaway inflation in the 1970s. The US is seeing inflation now, despite officials insisting it's temporary. Stage 6. Loss of trust. Citizens and foreign countries start doubting the currency. Roman soldiers wanted gold instead of denarii. Spain's lenders wouldn't extend credit after repeated defaults. The world shifted from pounds to dollars after Bretton Woods. Today, nations are gradually shifting away from the dollar. Stage 7. Collapse. The economic structure breaks. The currency becomes worthless or loses its role. The empire can't sustain its military or governing systems. Rome broke apart because it couldn't pay its troops. Spain sank into marginal status. Britain lost its empire within a generation. And the US, that's what we're living through now. 7 steps repeated 4 times over 2,000 years. Different empires, different eras, different currencies, but the same sequence. Because the math never changes. You can't spend endlessly, you can't print riches, and you can't erode your currency without paying the price. The pattern is ironclad, and we're in stage 5, slipping quickly towards stage 6. So what comes next? History offers 3 possible endings. First option, a managed decline. Think Britain after World War II. The empire disappeared, the currency lost its status, and the country endured painful adjustments. It became a second-tier power, but didn't fall apart completely. Second option, a disorderly collapse. Think Rome in the 5th century. The money becomes worthless, the government loses control, and society fractures. This is the worst scenario, a collapse not just of economics, but of the social and political order. Third option, a reset and rebuild. The system is replaced with a new one. Maybe the currency returns to gold backing. Maybe a new reserve currency emerges, China's yuan, a blend of currencies, or digital money. The old structure dies, but a new one rises fairly quickly. Painful, but survivable. The US now stands at this fork. The debt can't be paid back under current conditions, not with present spending. The choices are default, inflation, or restructuring. A default would instantly destroy dollar dominance. Inflation is already underway and could accelerate. Restructuring would require political unity that simply isn't present. And here's what makes the US situation different from Rome, Spain, or Britain. Those were regional powers. The US dollar anchors the entire world. When the Roman currency collapsed, it damaged Rome. When the dollar collapses, it impacts everyone, every central bank, trading system, and financial market. Global interconnection magnifies the consequences. But the pattern says it's on the way, not because of speculation, but because it has happened the same way 4 times already. 4 empires, 4 currency disasters, 4 identical sequences. The math behind empire doesn't bend. You can postpone the fallout, you can pretend it won't happen, but you can't escape it. Rome devalued its coins to pay soldiers. The denarius died. The empire fell. Spain drowned Europe in silver. Inflation destroyed its wealth. That empire faded. Britain borrowed heavily to fight 2 world wars. The pound collapsed. The empire dissolved. And now the US Prince Trillions runs perpetual deficits and claims it's different. It isn't. The pattern doesn't care about national pride, military power, or technological progress. The pattern is economic, and economic forces are as consistent as gravity. You can't create prosperity by printing money. You can't pile on debt endlessly. And you can't weaken your currency without threatening the foundations of your empire. 4 empires, 4 falls, 4 matching patterns. The only question left is timing. How long before confidence in the dollar breaks? How much time is left before the American empire joins Rome, Spain, and Britain in the history books? The pattern suggests we're close. The debt suggests we're close. The rate of money creation suggests we're close. And history, which has watched this exact cycle unfold 4 times, already suggests the outcome is unavoidable. The only unknown is how quickly it happens and how severe it becomes. If this shifted the way you see things, subscribe, because when the pattern finishes, you'll want to understand what happened and why. History provides the blueprint, and the pattern has never been wrong.